Welcome, Eileen, and thank you for joining us here this afternoon at the library.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. In my latest novel, The Folklorist, I explore what has come to be called the New England vampire panic. Can I see a show of hands of anyone who's actually heard of the New England vampire panic? One. Oh, you have, good. Because usually I don't get anybody, and I'm always surprised if I get even one. Well, I hadn't heard of it either until I watched a PBS documentary on it many years ago, in which folklorist Michael Bell explained the phenomenon. And I was fascinated by it, and I knew I wanted to write a novel about it. And when I did finally write it, I used a dual timeline of the 1830s and 1973. Because I wanted to explore both the New England vampire panic itself through the eyes of characters who took part in it, as well as the understanding of it as seen by a folklorist of more recent times. As Michael Bell explained in the documentary and in his book, Food for the Dead, which I have here and which I used quite a bit for research, among other things, that's Food for the Dead on the Trail of the New England Vampires. The phenomenon became dubbed as the New England Vampire Panic in the 1990s when in Griswold, Connecticut, some kids were playing near a hillside gravel mine and accidentally unearthed a skull and some bones. Parents of the kids called the police, who at first thought the bones might belong to victims of a local serial killer named Michael Ross. However, forensics showed that the bones were more than a century old. That's when Connecticut State archaeologist Nick Bellantoni got involved. Bellantoni determined that the hillside had been the site of a colonial-era farm cemetery, one of many in New England. He found 29 burial sites on this hillside, all of them following the usual New England pattern of burial for the 18th and early 19th centuries. All but one. That one showed that, unlike the other graves, the skeletal remains in that one had been completely rearranged. The skeleton had been beheaded, and the skull and thigh bones were set on top of the ribs and the vertebrae. Further forensics showed that the beheading, rib fractures, and rearrangements of the bones had taken place about 5 years after death. The coffin, which had the initials JB and the number 55 spelled out on it in brass tacks, had also been smashed. Presumably, JB were the man's initials and 55 was his age at death. And there was a man, a farmer, who lived in that area in the 1800s named John Barber, who died at age 55 of tuberculosis, so most likely it was him. The other skeletons were given a proper reburial, but JB was shipped to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. for further study. While consulting with other archaeologists about his find, one of Bellantoni's colleagues asked if he'd ever heard of the Jewett City vampires. Well, it turned out that in 1854, the townspeople of neighboring Jewett City, Connecticut, had exhumed several corpses due to the belief that at least one of them was leaving the grave to kill the living, and they were determined to find out who it was and put a stop to it. The event had been detailed in newspapers at the time, a few of which are still in existence. This led Bellantoni and his colleagues to wonder if the same thing might have happened in Griswold. So Bellantoni got in touch with Michael Bell and explained the situation. After hearing what Bellantoni had to say, Bell realized that it fit with what he'd been studying. The site where JB was found was rural, agrarian, and bordered southern Rhode Island, where multiple exhumations had taken place. Rhode Island was really a hotbed for it. The desecration of JB's body matched that of the Rhode Island skeletons. Even the rib fractures made sense. Those who exhumed JB had likely broken open his rib cage to remove his heart and burn it, just as had been done in Rhode Island. In the past 30-plus years, Bell has documented more than 80 exhumations going back as far as 1700 and extending all the way to Minnesota, though the vast majority are in New England and date to the 1800s. And he believes there's probably more. Bell and other scholars agree that exhumations and ritualized desecrations occurred during the worst outbreaks of tuberculosis, the scourge of the 19th century, which was then called consumption. Going back to JB, the museum's tests showed that he had, in fact, suffered from TB or a similar lung disease. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was rampant in the 19th century. It could take out all or nearly all of a family, a neighborhood, or a village. Oddly, it could also wipe out most of such groups while leaving others equally exposed untouched. But the quick succession in which victims succumbed and the wasting away of the person, hence the term consumption, since the victim appeared to be being consumed by something unseen, led to the superstition that one already dead was coming back to feed off living relatives. This was a superstition held mainly in rural areas and is thought to harken back to old European beliefs and folk customs. It wasn't until 1882 that the tuberculosis bacterium was identified, and it took quite a while for that breakthrough to become widely known. It was even longer before treatments became available in the 1940s. Meanwhile, there was this horrific disease spreading like wildfire that no one understood or could cure or control. As in Europe, the rituals surrounding the exhumations differed in various regions of New England. Some, like the single known case in Plymouth, Massachusetts, we only had one here that we know of, and some in Maine, chose simply to flip the offending corpse face down, rebury it, and leave it at that. Others were more complex. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, they frequently burned the dead person's heart, often having the sick relatives breathe in the smoke. Doing this was thought to be a cure. As in the case of JB, they, like their European counterparts, beheaded the corpse. And in Europe, they also often bound the feet with thorns. In this image from 19th century Romania, they appear to be shooting the corpse. Sometimes these exhumations were done clandestinely at night. Other times it was a public affair. In Woodstock, Connecticut, in 1830, a heart was burned on the town green. In Manchester, Vermont, in 1793, hundreds of people attended the burning of a heart on the blacksmith's forge. In his study of the New England vampire panic, Michael Bell has looked for reasons why people would do this. He says they had a reasonable to them basis for it, though as Bell states, reasonable is not always rational. It seems that when faced with dire circumstances that seem to have no earthly explanation and nothing rational works to remove or alleviate them, turning to folk remedies becomes a vile alternative. Fear is a great motivator, and consumption sparked a tremendous amount of fear in the 19th century. Imagine the desperation of a family who has lost one member after another and sees more clearly on their way out. Nothing the medical establishment or local healers have done works. No one knows what causes it or how to cure it. It doesn't even follow the same progression in each person. It touches some people living in the same home, but not others. Some people can have it and linger for years or even decades, while others succumb quickly. It's a dangerous, life-threatening, unknown entity that has even the experts baffled. That is a recipe for desperation. Then someone in the family or in the community remembers the old world folk remedy. They did this back in Europe for the same reasons. Why don't we try it? What do we have to lose? It's hard to imagine what it took to get people to exhume the bodies of their own family members. But the obvious gruesomeness of it aside, there is the tremendous sadness. These were people they loved. Now they're looking for signs that this person is coming back to take the lives of more family members. It's hard for us to grasp the mindset, not to mention what they were thinking when they saw the bodies, especially the ones that showed what they believed to be signs they were looking for. So can you just imagine the desperation they had to have felt to be able to bring themselves to do this? I tried to convey that fear and desperation in the 1830s timeline of the Folklorist. So in the excerpt that I'd like to read to you, Mary Kendall is talking to her neighbor, who's also her dearest friend, Lavinia Wicker. And Lavinia is trying to convince her to have the bodies of their deceased daughters exhumed, but Mary is adamantly against it. April 1832, Birch Falls, Vermont. Lavinia leaned toward Mary across the kitchen table. "It's the only way, Mary. I would not suggest it if I did not believe that to be so. I will not have it. Mary, I understand that it is hard for you. I would feel the same, but I would do it to save the rest of my family." Mary drew a sharp breath. She could scarcely accept that she was hearing such things from Lavinia. Part of her half believed she was dreaming. She hoped she would awaken soon to laugh at herself for entertaining such ridiculous fancies even in sleep. But this was all too real. It is absurd, Lavinia. Chauncey Haskell has read about it in the papers. They've done it in other places. Mary let out a laugh that was anything but amused. Chauncey Haskell. I should have known he was the source of this nonsense. I want no part of whatever mischief he is brewing. The nerve of him to suggest such horrid things. Lavinia shook her head, reaching across the table to take Mary's hand. No, Mary, this is not one of the tales he tells by the fireside. I assure you, he was in earnest. He knows this has been done before. He said, I will hear no more of this. Mary pulled her hand from Lavinia's. Now, if you please, I have much work to do, as I'm sure you do. She rose from her chair. Susanna and Jerusha are in the dairy. I have left them long enough. Lavinia rose, nodded, and headed towards the door. Just before letting herself out, she turned back. You may have no choice, Mary, she murmured. As people in the 19th century did not call the supposed guilty party a vampire, and if they had a word for it, I haven't been able to find it. But it seems that they believed that some sort of evil entity had invaded the corpse and was using it as a resting place during the day and rising out of the grave, perhaps as a vapor at night, to attack the living. They themselves seemed vague about what exactly was taking place. But this understanding of it would absolve their deceased loved one. It wasn't their fault. They were just they'd become an unknowing host. So perhaps thinking that way allowed people to do what they felt they had to do. So what were they looking for when they unearthed and opened a casket? They were looking for anything that was different from how they assumed the corpse should appear, such as the body having changed position, an appearance of the growth of hair or nails, and most especially fresh blood at the mouth or in the heart. And when they found these things, and they did find them, they naturally assumed them to be signs that something unnatural and evil was taking place. Everything they found that they mistook for being unnatural can be explained scientifically now. But in the 19th century, they didn't have all the forensics we have now and had no idea that what they were seeing had an explanation that wasn't otherworldly. So when they saw something like that, something that matched the stories from their European ancestors, what else would they think? They probably knew the word vampire, and I say that because it does crop up in some of the newspaper accounts that reported on the exhumations, but they weren't calling their deceased family members vampires, and they weren't thinking of them in the way we do today when we hear the word vampire. So how did it come to be called the New England Vampire Panic? Well, as I said earlier, that name was given much later. Today, the word vampire conjures up Dracula-type images thanks to this gentleman. Bram Stoker's book Dracula and the subsequent movies based on it cemented our image of the vampire. Remember that the book Dracula was not published until 1897, so most, if not all, of these exhumations had already taken place. The 19th century was almost over when the book was released, so no one before that had the Dracula image in mind. Vampire stories in literature existed before Dracula, but that particular book seems to have been the one that spawned our current idea of what a vampire is. As an interesting side note, Bram Stoker, who was born in Ireland and lived in England for almost 30 years, was aware of what had been going on in New England. Found in one of the notebooks he used while writing Dracula was an account from the New York World newspapers of the last known New England vampire, Mercy Lena Brown, who was exhumed in 1892 in Exeter, Rhode Island. It's likely the account Stoker read, along with the European folklore, inspired his story with perhaps a bit of Vlad the Impaler thrown in for good measure. Now, this is not that newspaper story that he had, but it does show the headline for an account of that same story. Stoker had been a London stage manager and was in New York in 1896 when the story ran. That was 4 years after Mercy Lena Brown's body had been exhumed, but anthropologist George Stetson was doing research on it at the time, and the papers were running stories on his findings. Some folks say that newspaper story couldn't have had a bearing on Stoker's novel because there wasn't enough time. Others believe that the name of his character, Lucy, was a possible amalgamation of Lena and Mercy. Also, Lucy is described in the book much like the descriptions of those suffering from consumption and she turns into a vampire and is exhumed. So is that coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Descriptions from the 19th century of people in the final stages of consumption portray the sufferer as emaciated, skeletal, burning with fever, which made their sunken eyes bright and their cheeks red, a bizarre contrast to the rest of their body, and constant coughing, which included the coughing up of blood. Because consumption is a lung disease, the patient would complain of a heaviness on the chest and say that it felt as though someone was sitting on their chest at night. It did seem to the observer that someone or something was drawing the life from them. Watching this, observers who believed the folklore could easily extrapolate what they were seeing with what they knew of the supernatural explanation. It seemed to them that it fit. And where did their notion of what was happening come from? Well, from Europe, of course. Stories of the undead coming back to harm the living are quite old in Europe. Archaeological evidence from grave sites similar to what Bellantoni found in Connecticut and what Michael Bell studies throughout New England goes back much further in Europe. Though 1732 seems to have been the explosion of vampiric lore in Europe, evidence goes back as far as 1500 for the folk belief. A 1732 definition of the word vampire from the Oxford English Dictionary states, "These vampires are supposed to be the bodies of deceased persons animated by evil spirits, which come out of the graves in the nighttime, suck the blood of many of the living, and thereby destroy them." This certainly sounds like the belief of the New Englanders who engaged in exhuming graves in search of the culprit of the illness and deaths of their other family members. So in my story, I have a 1973 setting with Charlotte LaJoy, a young woman who has recently earned her master's degree in folklore and has just begun as assistant director of programs for the New England Folklife Museum in Middlebury, Vermont. Her grandmother gives her an old diary she found while cleaning out the attic, which had belonged to their ancestor, Jerusha Kendall, in 1839. Reading the diary, Charlotte begins to suspect that her ancestors were involved in the vampire panic. According to the diary, something terrible occurred in the family, but Jerusha was very young at the time and she wasn't in on it. At the time she wrote her journal, she was 16 and reflecting back on that time. She's trying to figure out what must have happened because no one will talk about it. She feels like there's a big family secret that she's not privy to, and she's determined to find out what it is. She only knows it has something to do with a rift between her mother and their neighbor, Lavinia Wicker, but she doesn't know what caused it. Charlotte is captivated by Jerusha's diary and uses her own folklorist training to find out if her hunch is correct. This is all happening while she's dealing with a very sexist boss who is threatened by her high level of competence and starts trying to sabotage her career. So in the excerpt I'm going to read, Charlotte has already explained to her friend Heidi, a nurse who lives in the apartment across the hall from her, about the folk custom of legend tripping. And that's where kids, usually around the age 16, go as a group at night to a site that's supposedly haunted, expecting some supernatural happening. These sites generally have some long ago tragedy associated with them. In fact, most of the known sites of exhumations have become legend trips destinations. It's especially common in the summer and around Halloween. Folklorists consider legend tripping a rite of passage. So what I'm about to read takes place the day after Charlotte has explained to Heidi an article they came across in Yankee magazine about the New England vampire panic. July 1973, Middlebury, Vermont. Charlotte, you will never guess what happened today. Come in and tell me. Charlotte handed Heidi an orange crush once they entered her apartment, then, grabbing one for herself, plopped down on the sofa next to her. I was talking with some other nurses at lunch. I told them about your vampire article. I thought no one would have known anything about it, but it turns out one of them did. Oh? Yeah, Angela Preston. She grew up in Vergennes. Well, actually, it's in Birch Falls, but that's near Vergennes. Anyway, she said all the kids have known about it for ages. They do that legending thing at a grave because it's supposed to contain a vampire. Legend tripping. Yeah, so she's been to the grave. There's some weird inscription on it. What's the legend associated with it? Heidi looked blank. I don't know. She just said kids go to the grave at night. They say sometimes you can hear Eliza say something, but that's all I know. Eliza? The vampire, Eliza Kendall or something. Kendall? Charlotte felt a flash of recognition. Jerusha's maiden name had been Kendall, and she'd lived in Birch Falls. Charlotte didn't remember the mention of an Eliza, but her grandmother did say that Jerusha had sisters who died early. I guess. Anyway, she said that the kids leave fake vampire teeth like the ones for Halloween costumes. It's really weird, too, because no grass grows on her grave. That's part of vampire lore. Grass isn't supposed to be able to grow on their graves. Most likely it's because it gets a lot of visits from people who keep tramping it down. Maybe. Anyway, Angela said that a guy her friend used to date dug up the grave one night. Oh? Asked Charlotte, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. What did he find? She wasn't very clear on that. It's amazing she knew about it, though, huh? I'm not surprised. People who live in an area where it happened know the local legends about them. Do you know what year Eliza died? I could ask. I'd like to know. Jerusha lived in Birch Falls. I'm wondering if it was before or after her time. You think she might have known about it? Maybe. Did she mention anything in her diary about it? Not so far, but I haven't finished reading it. The conversation with Heidi sparked Charlotte's imagination, so after supper she immediately resumed reading the diary. She didn't honestly expect to find a reference to any vampire activity, though she did wonder if Eliza Kendall was related to Jerusha. The evening was warm, so Charlotte sat close to the open window, bare feet propped up on the coffee table. The entries after the 4th of July were routine again for a while, until she reached the one for July 10th. Hot and humid today, was sent to Mrs. Wicker by Father, as he said we owe them a day's work for help Frederick gave us last week. Mother said nothing but looked like a thundercloud, spent the day dyeing cloth. Endeavoring to learn the source of Mother's ill feelings towards her, I spoke about the corn husking frolics we had and how much we all loved the pies she and Mother baked together. I thought she looked wistful at that, so I plucked up my courage to say that I wished they would do so again. She only said those days are at an end. I told her it makes me sad to see her and Mother no longer friendly, and she allowed that it makes her sad as well. When I asked what brought about the rift between them, she only said, "You must hear it from your mother." When I said Mother will not tell me, she said to tell or not is for Mother to decide. She then went to tend the garden, and I saw little of her the rest of the day. Jerusha continued her musings in the entry for the following day. Rain today, worked at home. I was tired as I slept poorly last night. My thoughts kept returning to the times when Mother and Mrs. Wicker were friends. I tried to recollect just when the change occurred. I believe it was near the time Seth died, but I could not determine if it was before or just after. Only Susanna was left at home. Zachary had gone to Ohio and had not yet returned for her. Lizzie had been gone from us 3 months. Charlotte stopped cold. Lizzie? Was that Eliza? So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
When they talked about, you said in Plymouth, that was the only one in all of New England?
Of Massachusetts.
Of Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Now, was that one already investigated by the archaeologists?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was. I don't know, maybe we had, we had all the Salem witches. Maybe we didn't need that many vampires, too.
Well, no, maybe they found it better over the border.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the only one they know of. Yeah.
Do you think Polidori's the vampire had much influence in New England?
I'm sorry, which vampire?
John William Polidori's little novelette, novella, The Vampire.
Oh,
part of the 1816 Year Without a Summer.
Yeah.
That produced Frankenstein.
Possibly. I do remember that. It did come up in some of my research about that. That there's a couple of poems too that had mentioned it. So I mean, they did know the term but I don't know if it would have really pushed them to do this, because this came from like the folk customs of Europe, so that go way back. So, but he may have been. I don't know if he may have known about these things that were happening, and that might have inspired him to write that. So that's possible, that I don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Eileen, for coming, and we really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right.
So